Welcome to the Three Martini Lunch. Grab a stool next to Greg Columbus of Radio America and Jim Garrity of National Review. Three Martinis coming up.
Really glad you're with us today for the Monday edition of the Three Martini Lunch. But starting today through New Year's Day, we're going to have very special editions of the Three Martini Lunch. And as our longtime listeners know, these are our year-end Three Martini Lunch Awards for 2024. We are going to have 6 episodes where we have 3 awards each, starting today with most overrated, underrated, and honest political figures. We'll then move on to rising stars, fading into oblivion, political figures we're sorry to see pass away in 2024, best ideas, best political theater, worst political theater. We'll talk about the media, most overreported, underreported, and eventually we'll get to our person of the year, our turncoat of the year, and eventually our fearless predictions for 2025. So we blatantly ripped this idea off from the McLaughlin Group as soon as we got to our first holiday season there back in 2010. So these are some of their categories, but it holds up well. And as always, neither Jim nor I know who the other has chosen. Jim will go first, and so hopefully he doesn't take my first choice, but I usually have backups, and except for one of these categories today. So Jim, can't believe we're already to the end of the year, but it's time to kick it off with most overrated political figure.
And what a year it has been, Greg. Sometimes it's a rebuilding year, like for best political figure or something. You're looking around trying to think who you like. This is one of my favorite. We always start off one of my favorite, I think 3 of the easier categories to find selection for. Most overrated political figure of 2024. God, this was an intense competition. This was the 1983 quarterback class when it comes to overrated political figures, right? Marino, Elway, Kelly, Ken O'Brien. I'm going to sneak in there. All right, so with intense competition and so many strong contenders, my selection, although I have 2 honorable mentions, but I'll mention if they're not your picks, the most overrated political figure of 2024 is Minnesota Governor Tim Walz, the running mate of Kamala Harris. For a couple of weeks there, Democrats had talked themselves into believing that he was America's dad, and everybody loved him. He worked on carburetors. He was this corny, joke-telling, flannel-wearing car guy, high school football. And they were absolutely convinced America was going to love him, that he was going to be a big help to Harris in the blue states, the blue walls. Not only did he not help, and did she not win any of the blue wall states. Let's look at the state of Minnesota. Harris-Walz ticket won the state by 4.2 percentage points. 4 years earlier, Joe Biden and Kamala Harris won it by 7.2 percentage points. So adding the governor took 3 points off her lead. Way to go, Tim Walz. I strongly suspect that probably in about a decade, we will see him in a Saturday Night Live sketch, recurring the Tim Kaine sketch from earlier this year about how he was on a national ticket and nobody remembers him. Nobody wants to remember him. Nobody's going to be talking him up as a 2028 contender or anything like that. Good riddance, Tim Walz. You had your big moment, and yes, the sun, and I guess Minnesotans don't get a lot of time in the sun, period. But you had your big moment in the spotlight and struck out about as big as you can.
Bottom line, if you're running against Trump, don't pick a running mate named Tim. I think that's the
0 for 2. Yeah.
The biggest takeaway. But yeah, I mean, it seemed like all the momentum was for Josh Shapiro. And then all of a sudden, whether it was the anti-Israel crowd or, that's too obvious of a pick, so we're going to be a little cloak and dagger here and go with Tim Walz, who was mounting a very aggressive online campaign to be the running mate selection. And whether that worked, or it seems like she went with where the progressive wing of her party was shoving her, and she made a choice that clearly didn't help her. Didn't help her among men, didn't help her among blue collar folks, didn't help her probably among assistant football coaches or anything else. But Tim Walz, I think I might be talking a little bit more about Tim Walz later in our awards season, not today. Okay. But an excellent choice, because he came in with a lot of hype. The media was hyping both of them at that point. And so, they tried to turn him into a folk hero. And the more we got to know him, the less well he did.
Yeah. So. In short, Greg, if I had to summarize Tim Walz's time of 2024 in one word, I think that word would be weird.
Yes, definitely. I was tempted to go with Kamala here, but honestly... She was so...
Too obvious?
Appropriate. Well, obvious in part of it, but it was kind of a media manufacturing, although so was Tim Walz. Although most of America didn't know who Tim Walz was. Most of America had a pretty good idea what they thought of Kamala Harris, and it wasn't good until about, June 27th or July 21st, whenever date of the Biden debate fiasco you want to point to. And then they tried to make her the greatest thing since sliced bread. So she would have been a perfectly appropriate choice. I'm going to go with a little more out of the box one. And this is not a Lifetime Achievement Award because this person has obviously proved that in the past, they were not overrated because they accomplished considerable things, including 2 terms as president of the United States. But this year, Barack Obama inserted himself numerous times into the presidential campaign, and none of what he did paid off. First of all, he tried to cover up for Joe Biden, gently leading him off stage at the LA fundraiser. Everything's fine, everything's fine, everything's fine. But then the debate happens, and then he sends out George Clooney, most likely, with that op-ed in the New York Times saying, yeah, everything was terrible backstage. Biden is a shell of what he used to be, and so forth. That doesn't get written without Barack Obama's blessing. A lot of reports suggesting he was part of the aggressive effort to shove Biden out. Then he got blindsided by Biden endorsing Harris half an hour after he officially got out of the race. And so Obama held back because he knew that Harris probably wasn't going to be that great. Then he gives, what he usually does, a very rousing speech. It's full of malarkey at the Democratic convention, but it plays well with the base. But then he goes out on the campaign trail. Instead of being all hope and changey, which is hard to do when your party's in charge, he goes out there and gets angry. He gets frustrated with people, gets mad at people, including black men, for not being enthusiastic enough about Kamala. And so this is not well mic'd, but here he is scolding black guys about a month before the election.
You're thinking about sitting out or even supporting somebody who has a history of denigrating you? Because you think that's a sign of strength? Because that's what being a man is? Putting women down? That's not acceptable.
That's unacceptable. And the only reason you could possibly be voting for Donald Trump is because you appreciate the fact that he allegedly denigrates women. So, Barack Obama was never a very effective surrogate, even when he was in the White House. He campaigned for John Corzine and Martha Coakley and, all across the midterm elections, both of which he got crushed in. But he spent a lot of time on the campaign trail, got a lot of camera time, went to a lot of the swing states. Kamala didn't win any of them. And ultimately, she's the one responsible for that. But, he's the biggest celebrity politician in the party. And his angry look and his talking down to people, he's constantly disappointed in us, Jim. I think the shine came off a lot of the Obama reputation this year.
Greg, one of the reasons I enjoy doing this every year is that I go with my picks, then you go with one, and I'm always like, why didn't I think of that one? A very deserving award winner here. I guess I also should throw out, I also come up with an honorable mention. My honorable mention for this category was Dan Osborne, the so-called independent candidate for Senate in Nebraska. Listeners may recall at one point I was on some other podcast and someone told me that my assessment Republicans would win the Senate was erroneous because there was this challenger in Nebraska who was coming up strong and was going to deny Republicans a seat. I thought about naming him this category, Greg, but I just felt more appropriate for him to finish a distant second.
I like that idea. All right, Jim, let's move on now to Most Underrated Political Figure of 2024. Mine just slipped my mind, but hopefully by the time you finish yours, I'll remember who it was. That's what I get for not taking my notes to the studio.
I have a lot to say. So kind of in an inverse of the most overrated choice, my selection for the Most Underrated Political Figure of 2024, J.D. Vance, the Ohio senator who will soon be vice president of the United States. And I'm taking a little bit of crow with this. There are areas I agree with J.D. Vance, there are areas I disagree. When he was named Trump's running mate, I said, wow, Trump was picking the Trumpiest pick he could. This is the person out of all the options of, Doug Burgum and Marco Rubio and all these folks. This was the one who was most populist, most isolationist, the most like Trump's instincts. So then J.D. Vance goes to the convention. And, from the beginning, I was trying to give credit where it was due. J.D. Vance, blew the doors off the place in his convention speech. And he is a very effective speaker. And it was a weird thing. It was like, wow, I really don't like the direction he wants to take the party in, but he's really good at making the sales pitch for it. Then he went up and had a running mate only has two big moments in a campaign. But there were bad moments, the childless cat lady interviews with podcasts and stuff like that. But then they got up on the debate stage with Tim Walz, and everybody was ready for the red meat tossing firebomb, incendiary J.D. Vance, and it was distinguished gentleman J.D. Vance, the friendly neighbor, who everybody who just seemed utterly reasonable. And after painting this guy as a monster, and I don't think you could say, oh, that was the turning point for the whole campaign. There were a lot of things that happened in this campaign, but I think the momentum stopped. And you could even see it in the Saturday Night Live sketch, the degree to which Democrats who had built up Tim Walz in their mind and had believed that J.D. Vance was going to come out as this alt-right, knuckle-dragging, maniac, J.D. Vance came across as America's everyman neighbor. And I think he's well situated to be the not only a very effective and probably very influential vice president in the next term for Trump, I think clearly he's got the inside track to be the Republican nominee in 2028. So a guy who I've had my disagreements with, but who clearly is a very politically talented figure. J.D. Vance, you're underrated by a lot of people. And as the year comes to a close, you get the last laugh.
Jim, that is excellent. And as soon as you said J.D. Vance, I'm like, yes, of course, that's who my first choice was. And I agree with you. It was a little bit of a rocky rollout. You and I were not thrilled with the choice. I remember you thought the speech was well done at the convention, but didn't particularly like the content of the speech. But ultimately, I think he had the most consequential performance in a vice presidential debate that we've ever seen. He was calm, cool, and collected, basically destroyed the weird label that Tim Walz and the other Democrats tried to give him. However, for my official choice, since we don't like to always pick the same one, because that's not very exciting, I'm going to go with Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House. This is a guy who, in his first few weeks on the job after the whole deposing of Kevin McCarthy, and then there were 3 or 4 other people that they tried to put up there for Speaker that didn't get it. Ultimately, Mike Johnson does get it. There were some rough spots during Mike Johnson's first year and change as Speaker of the House. The worst moment, of course, was when they failed to impeach Mayorkas, and then because they didn't count the votes right or somebody switched after the voting started and so forth. And so not only did they have to admit that the vote failed, but he delivered the news. That you always send some, backbencher up there to deliver the bad news. But as time has gone on, it looks like he's got his conference together, and they're going to need that going into the next term, because once we have Gates gone, he already is gone, but he's not going to be in the new Congress. That seat will be empty for the first couple months. And then Mike Waltz and Elise Stefanik, he's going to have one vote to play with until these seats are filled. And so he's going to have to really keep the conference in line. And I think at this point, the fact that there was no challenge, no Tea Party challenge, I think this party seems to be rallying around him. We'll see how, everything goes. There'll be controversies, funding the government and all sorts of other things that could splinter the party. But in terms of major legislation, whether it's reviving the Republican House border security bill that went nowhere in the Senate last year, I feel like Mike Johnson is at least in a position to be a key player. And once they fill those seats, he'll have a little more breathing room to get stuff done next year, because the first year and a half of this Trump administration is going to be the one that matters. You never know what happens in the midterms. And once the midterms are over, everybody's talking about the presidential race. So it seems like Mike Johnson has settled things down. He kind of knows what he's doing now, and I think he's ready to do well in the next Congress. At least crossing my fingers, hoping so.
Greg, you are 2 for 2 for, even if I don't, I'm happy with my pick, and I don't think I should have picked your selection. The how did I not even think of that guy sense for both of them. So yes, both Obama and Johnson fit well for the labels of overrated and underrated. I had 2 honorable mentions for the category of most underrated. Not the biggest stories of the year, but I think worth a little bit of attention. Texas Senator Ted Cruz and Florida Senator Rick Scott. These were 2 more races where I was told, Democrats, keep an eye on them. They're getting close. In both cases, they won by more than one of them won by 1 million votes. The other one by 900,000 votes. Part of this is because Texas and Florida are big states, but and yes, they're red states. These were never competitive. These were never remotely competitive. And there's an endless supply of gullible liberal columnists who will write, oh, look, don't count out this, Colin Allred or the Florida Democratic Party. You should bury the Florida Democratic Party. It's not coming back anytime soon. So good job to those guys, but I think the most underrated figure remains J.D. Vance.
Yeah, I agree. I think he's number 1 for the year for sure. Points to Mike Johnson, though, also for being part of the UFC Trump posse. He there was one thing that didn't look quite like the others, with Kid Rock and Trump and Dana White rolling into Madison Square Garden, and he's pointing the guns, and he's doing this like Arsenio Hall when he comes into the arena. You have never predicted Mike Johnson in that position, but hey, politics is strange, man.
God bless him.
Strange.
Yes.
All right, Jim, on to our final category for this first edition of the Three Martini Lunch on this Monday edition. This is the one where I'm flying without a net. I've only got one name, but I think I'm probably safe, but we'll find out soon enough. Who's your choice for most honest political figure 2024?
Greg, a lot of years we've had rebuilding years in this category of most honest political figure. Actually, I have two. One will be honorable mention. I'm going almost old school, kind of a throwback, but I kind of feel like it fits. It is, famous Democratic strategist James Carville, famously derided by Rush Limbaugh as a snake oil salesman who looks like an actual snake. Carville, the entire year, was warning that the Kamala Harris campaign was in trouble. And you just gotta, they're just only in touch with the people. And he pointed out, referred to the young, snot-nosed punk progressive staffers on the Harris campaign who are having hissy fits over appearing on Joe Rogan. So, look, first of all, if you're a right of center, you look back at the 92 and even to a certain extent the 96 Bill Clinton campaigns as being, by the standards of today's Democratic Party, almost conservative, right? They were much more. Bill Clinton was running on a middle-class tax cut. And also Bill Clinton, for all of his many other flaws that I have enjoyed mocking on this podcast, Bill Clinton was a bit of a bubba. Bill Clinton did not walk around with contempt for rednecks or those who are rural or those who are grew up poor, because he was that, right? And there was much less elitist snobbery among Bill Clinton and that campaign than you saw in subsequent versions of the Democratic Party. No one may surpass John Kerry in that category. Actually, I was a little bit bully about Buckley. Anyway. But Carville, the entire campaign cycle, was saying, you guys are doing this wrong, and you're way too culturally elite. You're not in touch with the voters you need and the blue wall states. And he was right. He was completely correct. And the rest of the Democratic Party did not want to hear it. And there was this dismissiveness. Grandpa, you don't know what you're talking about. You won races back in ancient history. I think James Carville probably is more in touch with the average American and the average swing voter than the average Harris staffer or anybody else running the DNC these days. So good for you, James Carville. I don't know if the Democratic Party will listen to him. I hope they don't, otherwise, because that'll be good news for Republicans. But he was Cassandra. He was a prophet who was not recognized in his own land, and the Democrats paid the price. So here's to you, James Carville.
Yeah, Carville is out there a lot. Apparently, his entire wardrobe consists of LSU apparel for some reason. Every time he's interviewed, he's in some sort of LSU gear. But yeah, I mean, he was sounding the alarm on a lot of things. He understands how elections are won. I mean, Clinton, won with 43% of the vote in a three-way race in 1992, but he promised a middle-class tax cut, gave us a middle-class tax hike, along with everybody else in the country. And so Clinton didn't deliver on what was promised. But in terms of framing a message that resonates with the American people, and Clinton not only won Arkansas, which he was from, but he won Louisiana. He won Georgia once. He won Florida once.
Right? Yeah.
Tennessee, because Al Gore was on the ticket. Yeah, I mean, so the map looked so different. And it's because after Carter and Mondale, especially at the far left, and Dukakis. The message, not the policies that followed, but the message in 1992 was very, very different. And given, the economy being perceived as not great in the last few months of the Bush administration, they went from George H.W. Bush being invincible to not even getting 200 electoral votes. So
unemployment got all the way up to like 6-7%, Greg. Whew, boy, that was...
That was a media.
Obama years, we consider that a good day, but okay, fine, whatever. Yeah, so
that was a media creation for sure. Okay, so my choice it's a little bit of a stretch to call him a political figure, but he's a registered Republican. But his main job this year was as a special counsel, and his name is Robert Hur. And his job as special counsel was to investigate Joe Biden's handling of classified documents and whether any charges were warranted in that area, which became a more significant topic after Donald Trump was charged in that area. And so in the end, it turns out that Joe Biden did mishandle classified documents for many, many years, going back to his time in the Senate, his time as vice president, especially keeping stuff in a box in his garage near the Corvette. So in a normal situation, the guy could have faced charges. Now, Hur said for multiple reasons Biden would not face charges, including, and this is the one that got all the attention, there were moments in this conversation where Joe Biden really seemed to struggle with memory and just basic details. Couldn't remember when he started or stopped being vice president. Couldn't remember the year that Beau Biden died. So this report comes out ultimately saying no charges filed against Joe Biden. But here's our explanation for why. The Biden White House goes into crisis mode. Adam Schiff's up on Capitol Hill saying, how dare you include this? I mean, well, why wouldn't you? If it's a reason why you're not going to charge, you might want to explain why you're not going to charge. And so then Biden goes out the day this report comes out. He goes in this hastily arranged press avail at the White House on a Thursday night and blurts this out.
I know there's some attention paid to some language in the report about my recollection of events. There's even reference that I don't remember when my son died. How in the hell dare he raise that? Frankly, when I was asked the question, I thought to myself, it wasn't any of their damn business.
And then he promptly went on to call El-Sisi the president of Mexico. So that was not the best way to prove that you're mentally on the job. But then ultimately, lawmakers, especially on the Republican side, said, well, we want a transcript and we want the audio of this conversation. Never got the audio, but we did get the transcript. And it turns out that Biden was allegedly incensed about something that never happened because he was never asked about it. He brought it up. He couldn't remember. And Robert Hur simply documented that fact. And so despite Democrats briefly in Congress trying to demonize Hur for doing a political hit job on Biden, he told the truth. That was the Democrats' chance to pull the ripcord on the Biden reelection campaign. Instead, they decided to circle the wagons. And it was a major step towards a very bad year for the Democratic Party. But Bob Hur told the truth.
Greg, you're 3 for 3 now of excellent choices. Like, I can't believe I didn't remember that guy. So my honorable mention is very much in that vein. And I feel maybe a little bit of crow or a little bit of regret. Outgoing in terms of departing office, not in terms of his personality. Minnesota Congressman Dean Phillips, who I remember was, this year began with me in Des Moines, Iowa, getting prepared to cover the caucuses. Staying there because it had the most snow in 40 years. It's like Biden inflation. It comes once every 4 decades. And Dean Phillips, the New Hampshire Democratic primary was down the road. He'd held an event in Manchester and the turnout had been 0. Not a single person had shown up to his presidential campaign event. And I remember thinking, God, what a loser, what a terrible advance. And I remember enjoying, we all knew this was a long shot and that Dean Phillips was largely running to make the point of, hey, Democrats, I have pretty much the exact same agenda and worldview as Joe Biden, but I'm not geriatric. I am a relatively healthy man in his 50s. Go vote for me. He got nowhere. But I really feel he looks pretty vindicated in that, the entire, why were you, Joe Biden's health is fine and getting absolutely zero attention and zero traction in that Democratic primary bid. I think he ended up with 1 or 2% maybe. He beat Marianne Williamson, so good for that. But he basically was making the argument that we needed a younger nominee. Democrats didn't want to hear it. And then lo and behold, they ended up in exactly that situation. So Dean Phillips, you too were a prophet, unappreciated in your own land. You knew what you were doing. You at a time when everybody else insisted everything was fine, you were saying the emperor had no clothes because you'd forgotten to get dressed that morning. And good for you. I hope you have a happy and successful post-congressional life.
Yeah, that's a good choice, too. And, the party certainly stacked the deck in Biden's favor. Florida didn't even hold a primary. Other states made it impossible for Phillips to get on the ballot. Yeah. Yes. So, I don't think that Dean Phillips, given his limit.
When you're rigging the game against Dean Phillips, that's really kind of a sign of panic, isn't it?
It's not a sign of confidence, yeah. But
Brady didn't underinflate the footballs against the Jets. That's all I'm saying. So, didn't even need to cheat in those games.
What a year, and we're just getting started. So tomorrow is Christmas Eve, and tomorrow we're going to be talking about the figure we're most sorry to see go in 2024, as well as the rising star and the political figure fading into oblivion. So major categories once again. Make sure you join us for that. Jim, see you then.
See you tomorrow, Greg.
Jim Garrity, National Review. I'm Greg Corombos of Radio America. Thanks so much for being with us today. Do subscribe to the podcast. If you don't already, tell your friends about us as well. Thanks also very much for your 5-star ratings and your kind reviews. Please keep those coming. Get us on your home devices. All you have to say is play 3 Martini Lunch podcast. Follow us both on X. He's at Jim Garrity. I'm at Dateline_DC. Have a terrific Monday and join us again on Tuesday for the next 3 Martini Lunch.